No one spoke after Ethan's confession. The silence that filled the Carter family home felt different from the silence William had lived with for years. This silence wasn't empty, it was honest. For the first time in a very long time, there were no carefully chosen words, no rehearsed concern, no hidden motives. Only the uncomfortable truth. William slowly walked back to his chair and sat down. His body felt tired, not because of his age, because carrying disappointment for weeks had become heavier than he had ever imagined. He looked at each of his children. "I didn't ask David to read that letter because I wanted anyone to feel guilty." His voice remained calm. "I asked him to read it because I didn't know how to say those words while looking into your eyes." Grace quietly reached across the table and held her father's hand. Ethan remained standing. Unable to meet William's gaze, Olivia wiped away another tear. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. William nodded gently. "I know you are, but being sorry and changing are two different things." Neither Ethan nor Olivia argued. For once, there was nothing to defend. Several minutes passed before Ethan finally spoke. "When did you hear us?" William answered honestly. "The night you all came for dinner. I went upstairs to find the old family photo album." Ethan closed his eyes. "So you heard everything?" William nodded. "Every word." Olivia covered her face. "I've replayed that conversation in my mind 100 times since David started reading your letter. I wish I could take it back." William smiled sadly. "So do I." Grace looked at her brother and sister. "I don't understand. Why didn't either of you simply talk to Dad?" Ethan let out a long, defeated sigh. "I kept telling myself I was only trying to plan ahead, then planning slowly became expecting, and expecting became feeling entitled." He looked towards his father. "I didn't even notice it happening." Olivia nodded through tears. "I convinced myself we deserved something because we'd worked hard. I never stopped to think that none of us deserved anything. It was always your choice." William listened quietly. These were painful words to hear, but they were also the first truly honest words Ethan and Olivia had spoken in a long time. David Harper finally closed the folder containing the will. "My work here is almost finished." He reached once more into his briefcase. "There is one final item." He removed a small wooden box. William smiled immediately. "I wondered if you'd remember." David chuckled. "Helen made me promise." Grace looked puzzled. "What is it?" William carefully opened the lid. Inside lay 3 old brass keys. Each one was slightly different. Ethan recognized them instantly. "The workshop." Olivia whispered. "The attic." Grace smiled. "And Mum's garden gate." William nodded. "When your mother and I first bought this house, these were the only 3 keys we owned. We always joked that whoever held the keys was responsible for protecting what mattered most." He handed 1 key to each child. "This isn't about ownership, it's about responsibility." Ethan stared at the worn brass key resting in his palm. "It isn't worth anything." William smiled. "But I hope you'll never lose it." Olivia carefully traced the scratches along hers. "I remember dropping this in the snow when I was little." William laughed. "Your mother searched for almost an hour." Grace quietly held hers against her heart. The 3 keys suddenly meant more than any check David could ever write. David stood and gathered his papers. Before leaving, he turned toward the family. "I've spent 40 years handling estates. I've watched families destroy themselves over money. I've also watched families become stronger. The difference has never been the size of the inheritance. It has always been the choices people make afterwards." With that, he shook William's hand. Then he quietly left. The front door closed behind him. For the first time all afternoon, only the Carter family remained. Ethan slowly walked toward the living room window. He looked out across the front garden where he had once played baseball with his father. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," William answered without hesitation. "Forgiveness isn't something you deserve. It's something another person chooses to give." Ethan turned around. "Can you?" William thought carefully before answering. "I can forgive you. But trust." He paused. "Trust has to be rebuilt." Ethan nodded. "I understand." For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he truly did. Olivia stood and walked toward Helen's photograph above the fireplace. She gently touched the frame. "I've been so busy building my own life, I forgot the people who built mine." William quietly joined her. "Your mother used to say something." Olivia smiled through tears. "Gratitude fades unless you practice it." William nodded. "You remembered. I forgot to live it." Grace looked around the room. "So what happens now?" William smiled. "Now we have dinner." Everyone looked confused. "Dad, we've already eaten." William laughed. "I know, but your mother believed every difficult conversation should end with people sharing another meal. There are leftovers in the kitchen." For the first time that day, everyone smiled. An hour later, the 4 of them stood side by side preparing sandwiches from the remaining turkey. Ethan accidentally dropped a slice of tomato. Grace laughed. Olivia teased him exactly as she had when they were children. William watched quietly from the dining table. The sound of laughter returned to the house, not forced, not polite. Real. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever would be again, but it was real. And that was enough. Over the following months, small things began to change. Grace continued visiting every Wednesday. Only now Ethan often arrived on Tuesday evenings, not to discuss paperwork, simply to drink coffee with his father. Olivia began calling every Sunday. Sometimes they spoke for an hour, sometimes only 10 minutes, but never once did she mention the house. The family trust remained exactly as William had intended. The house was carefully maintained. Helen's scholarship fund awarded its first 2 students the following spring. Both young women were studying to become teachers. William attended the ceremony with quiet pride. He imagined Helen smiling beside him. One warm afternoon, nearly a year later, the tulips Grace had planted finally bloomed, bright red, exactly like Helen's favorites. William stood in the garden with all 3 of his children. No one spoke, there was no need. The flowers said enough. William looked at his family, then toward the house, then up at the clear blue sky. A peaceful smile spread across his face. I used to think inheritance was about leaving people something. He paused. I've learned it's really about leaving something inside them. Ethan gently placed a hand on his father's shoulder. We almost lost that lesson. William smiled. But you found it, and that's worth more than anything I could ever leave behind. The 4 of them stood together in the garden as a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming tulips through the air. The old house remained exactly where it had always been, not because bricks and timber lasted forever, but because it had become what Helen and William had always hoped it would be. Not a prize to be won, not an asset to be divided, but a place where a family could always find its way home. No one moved. The only sound in the room was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock that had stood in the Carter family home for nearly half a century. David Harper adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. He wasn't simply reading a legal document anymore. He was about to deliver a father's final lesson. He unfolded the handwritten pages with great care. William remained standing beside the fireplace, his eyes fixed on Helen's photograph. David began. My dear children, if you are hearing this letter, it means I finally accepted a truth I prayed I would never have to believe. Before you become angry with my decisions, I ask only one thing. Please listen until the very end. The room grew even quieter. Ethan folded his arms across his chest. Olivia lowered her eyes. Grace wiped away a tear before another could fall. David continued. When your mother and I bought this house, we had almost nothing. The roof leaked. The heating barely worked. We couldn't afford new furniture. Every wall held hope. William smiled faintly. He remembered carrying boxes into the empty house, while Helen laughed because they owned only one dining chair. For weeks they had taken turns sitting while eating dinner. Neither of them had cared. They had been building a life, not a collection of possessions. Over the years, that little house became your home. It witnessed scraped knees, school graduations, birthday candles, Christmas mornings, and the day each of you walked back through the front door after leaving for college. David paused for a moment before reading the next paragraph. I never believed I owned that house. I believed I was simply taking care of it until it became your memories too. Grace quietly covered her mouth. Across the room, Ethan stared at the floor. Then David reached the part William had written only a few weeks earlier. Something happened recently that changed my understanding of our family. I wasn't searching for secrets. I simply walked into one. Ethan slowly raised his head. Olivia's breathing became noticeably slower. I heard a conversation that neither of you knew I could hear. You weren't talking about my health. You weren't worried about losing your father. You were discussing my property. No one interrupted. No one denied it. William still hadn't turned around. He couldn't. The memory hurt too much. David's voice remained calm. One sentence has stayed with me every single day since then. Dad won't be around much longer anyway. Ethan closed his eyes. The color drained from his face. Olivia looked towards her brother in disbelief. She had hoped William had never heard those words. Now she knew the truth. He had heard every single one. David continued reading. I want you to know something. That sentence didn't break my heart because it reminded me that I will die someday. Every parent already knows that. It broke my heart because, for one brief moment, I realized you had stopped seeing me as your father. You had started seeing me as a future transaction. Silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Grace quietly began crying. She looked at Ethan, then at Olivia. Neither could meet her eyes. David turned another page. I considered confronting you. I considered pretending I had heard nothing. Instead, I decided to watch, not because I wanted evidence, because I wanted hope. William slowly lowered his head. Those words had cost him many sleepless nights. Every visit, every phone call, every conversation. I kept hoping I was wrong. I kept hoping your kindness was genuine. Sometimes it was. Too often. Ethan's hands trembled. For the first time in years, he realized that every carefully chosen visit, every rehearsed conversation, every question about planning for the future had been seen exactly for what it was. David's voice softened Grace. Grace looked up through tears. You never once asked me what you would receive. You asked whether I had eaten, whether I had taken my medicine, whether I was lonely. You planted flowers because your mother loved flowers. You fixed broken lights without being asked. You remembered the little bakery she loved. You reminded me every single week that kindness still existed inside this family. Grace buried her face in her hands. I wasn't trying to prove anything, she whispered. William finally turned around. I know. His voice was gentle. That's exactly the point, David continued. Ethan, Olivia, this letter is not written to shame you. It is written because I still love you. Love doesn't disappear simply because disappointment arrives. But love without honesty becomes meaningless. Both siblings sat completely motionless. The defensiveness that had filled the room earlier was gone. Only regret remained. Then came the sentence none of them expected. I have not punished either of you. You are still my children. You are still included in my will. But I refuse to reward behavior that would have broken your mother's heart. Olivia quietly sobbed. I am so sorry, she whispered. No one answered. Apologies spoken too late always carried a different weight. David reached the final page. If all I leave behind is money, then I have failed as a father. If what I leave behind helps you become better brothers, sisters, and parents, then I will leave this world believing your mother and I succeeded. William looked at every one of his children, not with anger, not with triumph, only sadness and hope. David folded the letter carefully. I believe there is one final instruction. He opened a smaller envelope that had been attached to the back. Inside was a single handwritten card. He read it aloud. Before any inheritance payments are released, I ask my 3 children to spend one full day together inside this house. No lawyers, no accountants, no discussions about money, only memories. Cook one meal together. Look through the family photo albums. Visit your mother's garden. If after that day you still believe this house is only a financial asset, then nothing I have written will ever matter. David lowered the card. No one spoke. The room was filled with tears. William slowly walked towards the dining table. He placed one hand gently on the worn wooden surface. This table, he said quietly, was never where we divided things. It was where we shared them. Ethan finally broke. He pushed back his chair, stood up, and covered his face with both hands. Dad, his voice cracked. I don't know when I became that man. William looked at him for a long moment. Neither did I, he thought. But he didn't say the words aloud, because another lesson still remained. The following Thursday morning, a cold rain fell steadily across Boston. Dark clouds hung low over the city as William Carter stood quietly beside the living room window, watching droplets race down the glass. His house was unusually quiet. Every room seemed to hold its breath. At precisely 10 o'clock, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. David Harper stepped out carrying a slim leather briefcase. William opened the front door before his old friend could knock. Right on time, William said with a faint smile. David returned the smile. You always taught me that important meetings deserve punctuality. William chuckled softly. I suppose I did. Inside, David carefully placed the briefcase on the dining room table. He looked around the familiar home. Very little had changed since Helen's passing. The photographs remained in the same places. The grandfather clock still ticked steadily in the corner. The scent of fresh coffee filled the room. It still feels like she's here, David said quietly. William nodded. In many ways, she is. Within the next 30 minutes, Ethan, Olivia, and Grace all arrived. None of them had been told exactly why David would be visiting. William had simply said there were family matters he wanted to settle. Grace greeted David warmly. It's been years. David smiled. Too many. Ethan shook David's hand confidently. Good to see you again. Olivia followed. I assume this won't take too long. David merely smiled politely. We'll discuss everything shortly. William invited everyone into the living room. No one noticed the sealed envelopes resting quietly inside David's briefcase. They spent a few minutes talking about ordinary things, the weather, work, the approaching holidays. The conversation felt strangely forced. Everyone seemed to sense that something important was coming. Finally, William stood. I've asked David here because I believe every family should settle important matters while everyone is together. Ethan nodded approvingly. That's actually very sensible. Olivia smiled. I completely agree. Grace looked confused. Dad, is everything all right? William walked over and gently squeezed her shoulder. I'm fine. I simply don't believe in leaving unnecessary confusion behind. He then looked toward David. If you're ready. David opened the briefcase. I am. He removed a thick folder. The document I'm about to read is the legally executed last will and testament of William Carter. Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Olivia. Neither attempted to hide the small smile forming on their faces. This was exactly what they had expected. David continued. I would first like to make something absolutely clear. This document replaces every previous version. The smiles disappeared instantly. Ethan frowned. What do you mean, every previous version? David calmly adjusted his glasses. Mr. Carter executed a new will several weeks ago. The room fell completely silent. Olivia stared at William. You changed it? William answered calmly. Yes, after very careful consideration. David continued reading. The family home shall not be sold or divided. Ethan immediately interrupted. What? David looked up. I'd appreciate it if questions were saved until the reading is complete. Reluctantly, Ethan leaned back, resumed. The Carter family residence shall become the property of the Helen Carter Family Trust. No individual beneficiary shall have the authority to sell, mortgage, or transfer ownership. Olivia blinked in disbelief. A trust? David nodded without emotion. The purpose of the trust is to preserve the family home for future generations. William remained silent. He watched every reaction carefully. David turned another page. The investment portfolio shall be divided according to the terms outlined herein. Ethan unconsciously leaned forward. Olivia clasped her hands tightly. Grace simply listened. She still seemed more concerned about her father's health than the legal language. Then came the next sentence. Ethan Carter and Olivia Carter shall each receive an equal financial inheritance, subject to the conditions described in Appendix A. Ethan relaxed slightly. So that's all? He almost smiled. Then David continued. The inheritance shall be distributed over a 10-year period. No beneficiary may receive the full amount immediately. Ethan's smile vanished again. What? Olivia looked equally stunned. 10 years? David nodded. The schedule was established personally by Mr. Carter. He continued reading. Any beneficiary who attempts to legally challenge this will forfeit his or her remaining share. The room became noticeably colder. Ethan looked directly at William. You actually included a no contest clause? William answered quietly. Yes. Olivia shook her head slowly. I don't understand. William remained composed. You will. David reached the section concerning Grace. Grace Smiller is appointed sole managing trustee of the Helen Carter Family Trust. Grace's eyes widened. David smiled gently. Yes, you will oversee the property, maintenance, charitable foundation and administration of the trust. Grace looked almost frightened. I don't know how to do any of that. William finally spoke. You know how to care about people. The rest can be learned. Grace lowered her eyes. Tears began forming almost immediately. Dad, I never wanted anything. I know. That's exactly why I trust you. Across the room, Ethan shifted uncomfortably. So Grace controls everything? David answered precisely. No, she manages the trust. She does not personally own the assets. Olivia crossed her arms. So none of us can sell the house. Only under the conditions specifically defined by the trust agreement. William watched disappointment spread across both their faces, not because they had received nothing, because they had lost control. David carefully closed the first folder. For legal purposes, the reading of the will is now complete. Silence filled the room. No one spoke. The ticking grandfather clock seemed louder than ever. Then David slowly reached back into the briefcase. I have one more document. He removed a large cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front, written in William's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For my children." Grace looked at her father in confusion. Ethan stared at the envelope without blinking. Olivia swallowed nervously. David held the letter gently in both hands. Mr. Carter instructed me that this letter was not to be opened until every one of you had heard the contents of the will. William quietly stood and walked toward the fireplace. He looked at Helen's photograph. Then he spoke only 6 words. This is the real inheritance. David broke the wax seal. He unfolded several handwritten pages. The first line alone caused every person in the room to stop breathing. If you are hearing this letter, it means I finally accepted a truth I prayed I would never have to believe. The following Sunday arrived bright and unusually warm for early November. By noon, the familiar aroma of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and fresh rosemary drifted through William Carter's home. It wasn't Thanksgiving yet, but William had decided there was no reason to wait for a holiday to gather his family. If anything important was going to be said, he wanted everyone together while he was still healthy enough to enjoy the evening. For nearly 2 hours, he moved carefully around the kitchen. Grace had arrived early, just as she always did. Without asking, she tied on an apron and began preparing vegetables. You should sit down, she said. I've got this. William smiled. I still know my way around my own kitchen. I know, but humor me. He laughed and surrendered the carving knife. Some battles simply weren't worth fighting. At 3 o'clock sharp, Ethan pulled into the driveway. He stepped out carrying an expensive bottle of wine. Thought we'd celebrate. William welcomed him with a warm handshake. Celebrate what? Oh, nothing in particular. Just being together. William nodded politely. A few minutes later, Olivia arrived with a professionally decorated cake. She hugged her father for longer than usual. You've been looking healthier. I've been feeling better. That's wonderful. Her smile lingered a second longer than it normally would. William noticed. Again, he noticed everything. Dinner began pleasantly. Stories flowed easily. Grace shared amusing moments from her classroom. William described the tulips they had planted together. Even Ethan laughed as he remembered crashing his bicycle into the backyard fence when he was 12. For a while, the atmosphere genuinely resembled the family they used to be. William silently wished it could stay that way. After dessert, Grace carried the empty plates into the kitchen. William followed to help. As they rinsed dishes together, Grace looked at him. "You seem happier today." "I do? You've smiled more." William chuckled. "Maybe I've finally accepted that life doesn't always go according to plan." Grace looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" He dried another plate before answering. "Sometimes, the hardest part of growing older is accepting people exactly as they are." Grace frowned slightly. "I still believe people can surprise us." William smiled gently. "I hope you're right." Back in the dining room, Ethan poured coffee for everyone. He waited until Grace returned before casually beginning a conversation. "Dad, I've been meaning to ask." William looked up. "Yes? Have you ever thought about writing down your wishes?" William stirred his coffee slowly. "My wishes, for the future, so nobody has to guess." Olivia immediately joined in. "It would actually make things easier for everyone." William remained calm. "Easier how?" Ethan leaned forward. "Well, there'd be less confusion, no misunderstandings, no legal complications." William noticed how carefully both of them chose their words. Neither one mentioned inheritance, neither one mentioned money. Yet somehow, money seemed to be sitting at the table with them. Grace looked between her brother and sister. "I think Dad will handle those things whenever he's ready." Olivia smiled politely. "Of course, we're only trying to help." William appreciated Grace changing the subject. She had no idea she had just interrupted a conversation heading somewhere very different. As evening settled outside, they moved into the living room. The fireplace crackled softly. Old family photographs covered the shelves. William noticed Ethan studying one picture for several seconds. It showed Helen standing proudly on the front porch the day they bought the house. "This place has appreciated enormously," Ethan said almost absent-mindedly. William looked toward the photograph. "It has." Olivia nodded. "Properties in this neighborhood are incredibly valuable now." William smiled faintly. "Some things are worth more than money." Neither Ethan nor Olivia answered. A little later, Grace excused herself to help Mrs. Thompson next door carry groceries inside. "I'll only be 10 minutes. After the front door closed behind her, silence settled over the room. Then Ethan spoke again. "Dad, I hope you know we're only thinking about what's best." William folded his hands. "What's best for whom?" The question lingered in the air. Olivia answered first. "For everyone." William held her gaze. "I've spent 45 years making decisions for this family. I've learned something." Both children waited. The words, everyone and fair, don't always mean the same thing. Neither Ethan nor Olivia replied. The conversation drifted into uncomfortable silence. Grace returned a few minutes later, completely unaware of the tension. She sat beside William and handed him a small paper bag. "I almost forgot. I picked these up yesterday." Inside was a packet of William's favorite homemade oatmeal cookies from a local bakery. His eyes widened. "I haven't had these in years." "I know. Mom used to buy them." William smiled. "She did." Grace shrugged. "I walked past the bakery and remembered. It wasn't an expensive gift. It wasn't elaborate. But it carried something far more valuable: attention. Mirror. Love." William quietly placed the bag beside his chair. The evening slowly came to an end. Coats were collected, goodbyes exchanged. Cars began leaving the driveway one by one. Grace hugged her father tightly. "I'll stop by Wednesday." "You don't have to." "I know, but I'll come anyway." William laughed. "I'll have tea ready. I'll hold you to that." She drove away smiling. Only Ethan remained. He lingered near the front door. "Dad, I've been thinking." William waited. "Maybe we should all sit down with a lawyer sometime. It would be good planning." William looked calmly into his son's eyes. Then, for the first time in weeks, he gave a direct answer. "That won't be necessary." Ethan blinked. "What do you mean?" William spoke quietly. "I've already taken care of everything." For the briefest moment, Ethan's confident expression disappeared. It was gone almost instantly. "Oh, that's good." He forced a smile. "I'm glad." William nodded. "So am I." Ethan left soon afterwards. When the house finally became silent again, William stood alone in the living room. He looked at Helen's photograph above the fireplace. "I think they're almost ready," he whispered. "Not ready for an inheritance, ready for the truth." Just then, his telephone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. "David Harper." William answered. "Everything is prepared," David said. "The documents, the letters, and the final instructions." William closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you." David hesitated before adding one last sentence. "William, I believe the time has come." William slowly looked around the house he and Helen had built together. Then he answered with complete certainty. "Yes, it has." Neither of them realized that within days, The reading of the will would expose secrets no one in the Carter family was prepared to face. The first Saturday of November arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. Golden leaves covered William Carter's front lawn like a patchwork quilt. He had just finished raking them into neat piles when a familiar blue sedan pulled into the driveway. Grace stepped out carrying 2 paper bags. One contained groceries, the other contained flower bulbs. William smiled. "You always bring more than you need," Grace laughed. "And you always say that." She walked over and gently took the rake from his hands. "You're done for today. I've only just started." "No, you've done enough." William didn't argue. He had learned long ago that when Grace decided to help someone, there was very little anyone could do to stop her. Inside the kitchen, Grace unpacked everything with her usual quiet efficiency. Fresh vegetables, soup ingredients, tea, medicine, a loaf of warm bread from the local bakery. Then she held up a small packet of tulip bulbs. "I thought we could plant these beside Mum's roses." William looked at the packet for several seconds. Helen had always loved tulips. Every spring she would wait eagerly for the first blooms. After she passed away, William had never found the heart to plant new ones. "I think she'd like that," he said softly. Together they spent the afternoon working in the garden. Neither of them spoke very much. They didn't need to. Some relationships were comfortable enough to exist in silence. As they knelt in the soil, Grace suddenly smiled. "Remember when Mum caught Ethan trying to dig up all the bulbs because he thought treasure was buried underneath?" William laughed. He was convinced flowers grew from gold coins. And Olivia cried because she thought he'd killed spring forever. The laughter lingered long after the story ended. For the first time in weeks, William felt genuinely at peace. Later that afternoon they sat on the back porch with steaming mugs of tea. The maple tree behind the garden had turned brilliant shades of red and orange. Grace looked across the yard. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "You've been quieter lately." William smiled gently. "Have I?" "A little. You don't have to tell me why. I just wanted you to know. If something's bothering you, I'm here." William looked at his youngest daughter. There it was again. Not a question about property. Not a question about money. Not a question about paperwork. Only concern. Real concern. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you." Grace smiled. "You've spent your whole life taking care of us. You're allowed to let someone take care of you now." William felt his throat tighten. He quickly looked toward the garden before she could notice the tears forming in his eyes. As evening approached, Grace prepared dinner. While chopping vegetables, she casually asked, "Has Ethan been calling more?" "He has." "And Olivia?" "Quite often." Grace smiled. "That's good. I know they've been busy. Maybe they're finally slowing down enough to appreciate family." William looked at her for a long moment. She truly believed the best of her brother and sister. She had no idea about the conversations he had overheard or the meetings, or the carefully disguised questions about his estate. He considered telling her everything, just once, just to share the burden, but he couldn't. He didn't want Grace carrying pain that wasn't hers. Instead, he simply said, "I hope you're right." The following Tuesday, William attended his regular medical checkup. His doctor, Dr. Anderson, reviewed the test results with a reassuring smile. "Your blood pressure looks much better. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." William chuckled. "I'm trying to avoid unnecessary stress." Good advice. As he left the clinic, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Grace. "Don't forget to drink plenty of water today." A minute later, another message appeared. "And don't skip lunch." William smiled. She still worried about him the same way Helen once had. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then another message arrived. This one was from Ethan. "Need to talk sometime this week. Nothing urgent." A few seconds later, Olivia sent one too. "Hope you're feeling well. Let me know if you need anything." William stared at the screen. 3 messages, 3 children. Yet only one of them had remembered why he had gone to the doctor in the first place. That evening, William opened the leather notebook once again. He slowly wrote, November 3. Grace helped in the garden, planted tulips for Helen, asked how I was feeling. Never mentioned the future. Ethan texted, wanted to talk. No mention of my appointment. Olivia wished me well, didn't ask about the results. He closed the notebook. The entries were becoming painfully predictable. A few days later, William decided to visit the attic. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight as he climbed the old wooden ladder. Boxes filled every corner. Christmas decorations, old camping equipment, school projects, family photographs. He found a cardboard box marked simply Helen. Keep forever. Inside lay dozens of handwritten letters. Some were addressed to him, others to the children. One envelope caught his attention. Across the front, in Helen's elegant handwriting, were the words, "For whoever needs this most." William carefully unfolded the letter. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about possessions. Helen had written about kindness, about gratitude, about how families slowly drift apart when they begin counting what they're owed instead of appreciating what they've already been given. One sentence stopped William completely. "If our children ever fight over what we leave behind, Remind them that love was always meant to be the greatest inheritance. William closed his eyes. It felt as though Helen were speaking directly to him across the years. At that moment, he knew exactly what his own final letter would say. The next morning, William called David Harper. "I need to add one more thing." "Of course," David replied. "What is it?" "I want my children to receive something their mother wrote." David paused. "I think that's a beautiful idea." "So do I. But only after they've heard my own letter. It may help them understand. I'll make sure it happens exactly that way." That Friday evening, William sat alone in the living room. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace. Outside, the wind carried fallen leaves across the empty street. He looked around the house. The same walls, the same photographs, the same memories. Yet everything felt different now, not because the house had changed, because he had. He no longer measured his children's love by how often they visited. He measured it by what filled the silence between their words. And silence, he had learned, often revealed far more than conversation ever could. Just then, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed Ethan's name. Williams answered. "Dad, we were thinking, how about everyone comes over next Sunday? A proper family dinner." William looked toward Helen's photograph above the mantel. A slow, thoughtful smile crossed his face. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I think it's finally time we all sat down together." Neither Ethan nor Olivia realized that this dinner would become the beginning of the end of every plan they had been quietly building. 3 days after William visited David Harper's office, his mobile phone began ringing more often than it had in the previous 3 months combined. The first call came from Ethan. "Dad." His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "I was thinking, we haven't spent much time together lately." William leaned back in his armchair. "That's true. So, how about lunch tomorrow?" William glanced at the calendar on the kitchen wall. His son hadn't invited him anywhere in almost a year. "That sounds nice. I'll pick you up at noon." As the call ended, William sat quietly for several moments. Only a week earlier, Ethan had struggled to spare 4 minutes for a conversation. Now he suddenly had an entire afternoon available. William wasn't suspicious, not yet, but he noticed. And lately, he had begun noticing everything. The following afternoon, Ethan arrived exactly on time. He was dressed casually instead of wearing his usual business suit. "Ready?" William smiled. "Lead the way." Instead of driving to one of their old favorite diners, Ethan chose an expensive country club overlooking a golf course. The staff greeted him by name. During lunch, Ethan laughed often. He asked about William's childhood. He listened to stories he had heard dozens of times before. For a brief moment, William almost allowed himself to believe things were changing. Then Ethan casually stirred his coffee. "So, I've been thinking about the future." William looked up. "What future?" "You know, yours." William smiled politely. "I'm still planning on sticking around for a while." Ethan laughed. "I hope so. I'm just saying, it might be smart to organize things while you're healthy." William remained silent. Ethan continued. "Lots of families fight because nothing gets planned. I'd hate for that to happen to us." William studied his son's face. The concern sounded genuine, but something behind the words felt rehearsed, almost prepared. He answered carefully. "I appreciate your concern. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." Ethan nodded. The subject disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but William couldn't ignore how naturally it had entered the conversation. 2 evenings later, Olivia arrived carrying shopping bags. "I brought dinner." William raised an eyebrow. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." She unpacked roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, and a bottle of sparkling cider. The evening felt relaxed. They talked about the grandchildren, travel, old family holidays. Then Olivia stood in the hallway studying the framed photographs. "You know, this house really is beautiful." William smiled proudly. "Your mother designed most of it, I remember." Olivia slowly walked through the living room. "I suppose it'll be strange when someone else owns it." William looked directly at her. "What makes you think someone else ever will?" Olivia hesitated. "I didn't mean, I just meant, eventually." William simply nodded. No argument, no accusation, only another quiet observation. That weekend Grace visited as usual. She carried nothing except a small toolbox. The porch light still flickers. "I thought I'd replace it." William laughed. "You've become quite the repairwoman. I watched enough YouTube videos." Within half an hour the light was working perfectly, where Grace wiped the dust from her hands. "There, good as new." William thanked her. She smiled. "You've done far bigger things for me." As they sat on the back porch drinking tea, Grace asked, "Have Ethan and Olivia been visiting more?" William nodded. "They have." "That's nice." William studied her expression. There wasn't the slightest hint of jealousy, no suspicion, no curiosity. She genuinely seemed happy that her brother and sister were spending more time with him. That simple reaction touched William more than she realized. The following Monday, William stopped at a local pharmacy to collect his prescription. While waiting, he heard 2 familiar voices in the next aisle. Ethan and Olivia. They hadn't noticed him. William remained behind a display of greeting cards. "You've been seeing him too?" Olivia asked. "Twice this week. Any idea if he's updated anything?" "Not yet. I couldn't get him to say much." Olivia sighed. "We have to stay close. If Grace suddenly becomes involved, everything changes." Ethan lowered his voice. "I don't think she knows anything. Let's keep it that way." William felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. Their kindness, the lunches, the dinners, the phone calls, none of it had been spontaneous. It was strategy. He quietly collected his medicine through another checkout without them ever seeing him. That night, William reopened the small leather notebook. He added another entry. October 22. Ethan invited me to lunch, mentioned organizing my estate. Olivia brought dinner, mentioned future ownership of the house. Both appear unusually attentive, possible reason unchanged. He stared at the final sentence for a long time. Then he closed the notebook. Writing the truth somehow made it more painful. The next morning, the telephone rang again. It was Ethan. "Dad, a few of us are thinking about spending Thanksgiving together." William smiled. "I'd like that. Maybe we should do it here." William agreed. After hanging up, he looked around the dining room. This house had hosted 43 Thanksgiving dinners. Helen had always insisted there should be one extra chair at the table. "You never know who might need a family meal," she would say. William wondered what she would think if she could see the family now. Later that afternoon, someone knocked on the front door. It wasn't one of his children. It was his neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, an energetic widow in her late 70s. "I baked too many blueberry muffins." William laughed. "Again? I'm starting to think you deliberately bake extra," she grinned. "Maybe." As they shared coffee in the kitchen, Mrs. Thompson smiled knowingly. "Your driveway's been busy lately." William nodded. "The children have been visiting. That's wonderful." He hesitated. "Yes, it is." She looked at him carefully. "But," William shook his head. "Nothing." After all, how could he explain something he still wished wasn't true? That evening, William walked slowly through every room of the house. The study, the dining room, the staircase. Helen's sewing room, exactly as she had left it. Every corner held another memory, another piece of their life together. He suddenly realized something. His children no longer looked at this home the way he did. To them, it represented value. To him, it represented love, and those were two entirely different things. He stood before the large living room window. As darkness settled outside, his reflection stared back at him, older, tired, but clearer than ever before. His decision at David Harper's office had been the right one. He no longer questioned it, not even for a second. What William didn't know was that Ethan and Olivia had already begun discussing something far more dangerous than inheritance. They had started making plans for the house itself, plans they believed their father would never discover. The following morning arrived cold and gray. A light mist drifted over the quiet streets of Boston as William Carter parked outside Harper & Associates, the same law firm that had handled every important legal document for his family during the past 25 years. He turned off the engine but remained sitting inside the car. The steering wheel rested beneath his weathered hands. He wasn't nervous. He was remembering. The last time he had walked through these doors, Helen had been sitting beside him. They had laughed because she insisted on bringing homemade cookies for everyone in the office. David Harper had joked that clients should visit more often if they came bearing desserts. Those memories now felt like they belonged to another lifetime. William took one slow breath before stepping out into the crisp morning air. David Harper was already waiting. The lawyer had grown older too. His dark hair had turned almost completely silver, but the kindness in his eyes had never changed. "William." They shook hands warmly. "I'm sorry we had to meet under circumstances like these." William smiled faintly. "So am I." David led him into a quiet conference room overlooking the city. Fresh coffee waited on the table. Neither man reached for it. After several moments of silence, David finally spoke. "When you called yesterday, I had a feeling something serious had happened." William nodded. "It has." David waited patiently. Over the years he had learned that William preferred gathering his thoughts before speaking. Finally, William looked directly at his old friend. "I heard my children discussing my inheritance." David remained silent. "They thought I wasn't listening." William paused. "They weren't worried about losing me. They were worried about dividing what I'd leave behind." The room became very quiet. David lowered his eyes for a moment before asking gently, "Are you certain you heard correctly?" William answered without hesitation, "I wish I hadn't." David folded his hands together. "William, I need to ask you something. This decision, is it being made because you're angry?" William looked through the large window at people hurrying along the pavement below. "When Helen died, I promised myself I'd never make an important decision while grieving. I waited. When I retired, I promised myself I'd never make an important decision while feeling lonely. I waited." David listened carefully. William continued, "Now I'm making this decision because I finally accepted the truth. The truth isn't pleasant, but it's still the truth." David slowly nodded. That was the answer he had hoped to hear. He opened William's existing estate file. The document was thick, decades of planning, property records, investment accounts, insurance policies, the original will. David slid the old document across the table. This is still your current will. William looked at it quietly. According to the original version, Ethan and Olivia would each receive 40% of the estate. Grace would receive 20%. At the time, the arrangement had seemed fair. Ethan had helped expand the family business. Olivia had been raising 2 young children. Grace had insisted she needed less because she loved teaching more than money. No one had argued. Back then, they had still felt like one family. William gently closed the folder. I don't want this anymore. David retrieved a blank legal worksheet. What would you like to change? William didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded sheet of paper. I wrote this last night. David unfolded it. The handwriting was steady. Every instruction had been carefully organized. The lawyer looked up with surprise. You've thought this through. For weeks. William corrected him softly. For years. One by one they reviewed every asset, the family home, retirement accounts, investment portfolio, savings, personal possessions, Helen's jewelry, the vintage pickup truck William had restored with Ethan decades earlier, boxes of photographs, letters, even the old piano Helen had played every Christmas Eve. William wasn't simply distributing possessions. He was deciding which memories would survive. Finally, David asked the most important question. And the house? William looked toward a framed photograph hanging inside the conference room. It reminded him of home. No one sells it. David blinked. What do you mean? William smiled sadly. The house stays in the family. It becomes a family trust. No individual owner. No one can force a sale. If my children wish to keep it, they'll have to keep it together. David slowly leaned back. I've never heard you say anything like that before. William nodded. Neither have they. There was one more change, perhaps the most unexpected of all. William instructed David to establish a small educational foundation in Helen's name. Each year it would provide scholarships for local students training to become teachers. David looked surprised. Helen would have loved this. William smiled. She always believed the greatest investment wasn't property. It was people. As the meeting continued, William added one final instruction, something that wasn't about money. It wasn't about property either. He wanted each of his children to receive a handwritten personal letter, not from the lawyer, from him. Each letter would be different. Each would contain memories, regrets, gratitude, and one final lesson. David carefully wrote down every detail. I'll make sure they're delivered exactly as you've instructed. 3 hours later, the documents were complete. David placed the final pages before William. This replaces every previous version. William read each page carefully. He had spent his career checking blueprints before approving construction. Today felt strangely similar. Only this blueprint wasn't for a building. It was for the legacy he would leave behind. He picked up the pen. For just a second his hand hesitated. He thought of Helen. He imagined what she might say. Then, with calm certainty, he signed. David signed beside him. The witnesses entered. The legal formalities were completed. When the final page was placed into the official file, David closed the folder. It's done. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, David broke the silence. William, do you think they'll understand? William looked toward the rain beginning to fall outside the window. Maybe not. At least not at first. But someday, I hope they'll realize this was never about punishment. It was about reminding them what families was supposed to mean. As William prepared to leave, David walked him to the front door. If you ever change your mind, we can revise it again. William smiled gently. I don't think I will. For the first time in many years his heart felt lighter, not because he had taken something away from anyone, but because he had finally aligned his final wishes with the values he and Helen had shared for an entire lifetime. He stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. Across the street, a black SUV sat parked with its engine idling. William paid it no attention. He had no idea that inside the vehicle someone had just watched him leave the law office, and that before sunset, a phone call would set an entirely new plan into motion. The sealed envelope remained on William Carter's desk until sunrise. He hadn't opened it, not yet. Instead, he sat quietly beside the living room window, watching the flashes of light spill across the front garden. For more than 40 years, every important decision in his life had been discussed with Helen first. Now she was gone. The silence that followed every difficult choice still felt unfamiliar. William gently placed the envelope back inside the lockbox. No, he whispered. I already know what I have to do. The conversation he had overheard the previous evening echoed relentlessly in his mind. Dad won't be around much longer anyway. The words hurt far more than he wanted to admit, but beneath the pain came something unexpected: clarity. For years he had excused his children's behavior. Busy careers, bussy families, bussy lives. Now for the first time he wondered if he had been making excuses for people who had simply stopped seeing him as their father. Instead, they had begun seeing him as an inheritance waiting to be divided. William decided he would not confront anyone. Arguments changed very little. Axes revealed everything. If he wanted the truth, he would simply watch. Over the following weeks, he kept a small leather notebook beside his favorite armchair, not because he wanted evidence against his children, but because memories could become unreliable when mixed with emotions. Every evening he wrote only facts, nothing more, nothing less. October 6. Grace visited after work, fixed the leaking kitchen tap, cooked dinner, stayed until Dad finished eating, never mentioned money. October 8. Ethan called. Conversation lasted 4 minutes, asked if the property tax assessment had increased, did not ask how Dad's medical appointment went. October 10. Olivia visited, brought expensive chocolates, spent 20 minutes discussing neighborhood house prices, suggested downsizing while it's still practical. William closed the notebook. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Grace stopped by carrying grocery bags. "You shouldn't be lifting heavy things anymore," she said. William smiled. "I've been lifting heavy things since before you were born, and now you don't have to." She unpacked fresh vegetables, soup, fruit, and medicine. As she organized the refrigerator, she noticed several expired items. "When was the last time you checked these?" William laughed quietly. "I suppose I forgot." Grace didn't scold him. She simply threw them away and made a shopping list for next week. Before leaving, she noticed the old porch light flickering. "I'll call someone." "You don't have to." "I know, but I want to." William watched from the window as she drove away. She never stayed because she expected anything. She stayed because she cared. 2 days later, Ethan arrived unexpectedly. William was pleasantly surprised. "Coffee?" William asked. "Can't stay long." Ethan glanced around the living room before sitting down. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "The house." William remained silent. "It's getting older. It probably needs expensive maintenance. It might actually make financial sense to sell it eventually." William looked at the photographs lining the fireplace. "I've never thought of selling." Ethan forced a smile. "Just something to consider." The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. As Ethan walked toward the front door, his phone rang. He answered immediately. William couldn't help overhearing. "No, not yet. He hasn't decided anything, but we'll know soon enough." The door closed behind him. William stood alone in the hallway. He wondered who "we" referred to. A week later, Olivia invited William to lunch. It had been months since she had asked to spend time together. At first, he allowed himself to believe she simply wanted to reconnect. The restaurant overlooked the harbor. The food was excellent. For nearly half an hour they talked about ordinary things. Old holidays, Grace's teaching job, the grandchildren. Then Olivia leaned forward. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Have you ever thought about simplifying your estate?" William carefully placed his fork on the table. "What do you mean?" "You know, a trust, updating documents, making things easier for everyone." She smiled politely. "It would avoid future conflict." William studied her expression. She sounded concerned, but her eyes betrayed something different, expectation. He answered calmly, "I'll think about it." Olivia relaxed immediately. "I'm glad." "So am I," William replied, but they meant very different things. That evening, William returned home feeling emotionally exhausted. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same destination: the house, the investments, the future. Never once had either Ethan or Olivia asked a simple question. "Dad, are you happy? Are you lonely? Is there anything you need?" Those questions never came. Late that night, William opened an old wooden drawer in his study. Inside were decades of family memories, report cards, birthday cards, children's drawings, a Father's Day card from Grace when she was 8 years old. The uneven handwriting made him smile. "Daddy, thank you for fixing everything." He wiped away a tear. There had been a time when all 3 children had written cards just like that. He wondered where those children had gone. The next morning, William picked up the telephone. He dialed a number he had known by heart for nearly 20 years. A familiar voice answered. "Harper and Associates. This is David Harper speaking." "David, it's William Carter." A brief pause, then warmth filled the lawyer's voice. "William, it's been far too long. What can I do for you?" William looked toward the family photograph on the mantel. His answer came without hesitation. "I think it's time we updated my will." Silence filled the other end of the line for just a moment. Then David replied quietly, "I'll clear my schedule. When would you like to come in?" William looked out at the maple tree where autumn leaves drifted slowly across the lawn. "Tomorrow morning. I don't think this should wait." David's answered with gentle professionalism. "I'll be ready." William hung up the phone. For the first time in weeks, he felt strangely peaceful. He wasn't acting out of anger. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was simply making sure that the life he and Helen had spent decades building would honor the values they had always believed in. What he didn't know was that someone else had already begun making plans of their own. The first cool breeze of October drifted through the open kitchen window as William Carter carefully stirred a pot of homemade beef stew. The familiar aroma filled the old house. It was the same recipe his late wife, Helen, had taught him more than 40 years earlier. Every Sunday after church, she would stand exactly where he was standing now, humming softly while their 3 children chased one another through the hallway. Now the house was almost silent. The laughter had disappeared years ago. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock remained. William smiled to himself anyway. Today was different. For the first time in months, all 3 of his children had agreed to come for dinner. At 72, William no longer expected grand celebrations. He simply treasured the rare moments when everyone sat around the same table. He placed fresh bread into the oven and glanced at the framed family photograph above the fireplace. Helen's warm smile looked exactly as he remembered. "I think you'd be happy today," he whispered. "They're all coming home." A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Grace arrived first. She stepped inside carrying a small apple pie wrapped in a kitchen towel. "I thought dessert might save you some work," she said with a smile. William hugged her tightly. "You always think of everyone else." Grace laughed. "I learned from you." She immediately walked into the kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and began setting the table without being asked. It had always been that way. She noticed the little things, the empty water pitcher, the missing napkins, the burnt-out dining room bulb. William watched quietly. She reminded him so much of Helen. Half an hour later, Ethan arrived in a new luxury SUV. He walked inside while speaking into a wireless headset. "Yeah, move the meeting to Tuesday. No, don't sign anything until I review it." He ended the call only after entering the dining room. "Hey, Dad." They exchanged a quick hug. Before William could ask how work was going, Ethan's phone vibrated again. "Sorry, business never stops." William nodded politely. "I understand." Soon after, Olivia arrived carrying an expensive bouquet. She kissed William on the cheek. "You look good, Dad." "So do you," William replied warmly. Within minutes, everyone was seated around the dining table. For a little while, it almost felt like old times. Grace asked about childhood memories. William shared stories about camping trips and Christmas mornings. Everyone laughed. Even Ethan put his phone away. William allowed himself to believe that perhaps the distance between them was beginning to disappear. After dinner, Grace offered to wash the dishes. William climbed the stairs to retrieve an old photo album. He wanted to show his grandchildren pictures from decades earlier. As he reached the hallway overlooking the dining room, he realized he had forgotten which cupboard held the album. He stopped. Voices floated upward from below. At first, he wasn't paying attention, then he heard his own name. "Dad still hasn't updated the paperwork," Ethan said. Olivia answered quietly. "I know." William froze. He remained perfectly still. "The house alone has to be worth well over $1 million now," Ethan continued. "And don't forget his investments." Olivia sighed. "If we're smart, we should settle everything before there's confusion." William frowned. "Confusion?" He leaned slightly closer without making a sound. "What if Grace starts asking questions?" Olivia whispered. Ethan laughed softly. "Grace doesn't care about money. She never has. Which makes this easier." William's heartbeat slowed. Something felt terribly wrong. Olivia lowered her voice even more. "We deserve more. We've sacrificed enough." Ethan answered without hesitation. "Dad won't be around much longer anyway." The words struck William like a physical blow. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. He stared at the family photograph hanging in the upstairs hallway. Helen's smiling face seemed almost unreal now. Below him, the conversation continued. "We'll probably have to sell the house. It makes no sense keeping it. The market is perfect right now." William looked around the hallway. Every wall held memories, pencil marks showing how tall the children had grown, a scratch from Ethan's first bicycle, the staircase where Olivia had fallen on her 6th birthday, the front window Helen had insisted should always face the sunrise. To them, it had become an asset. To him, it was an entire lifetime. He quietly stepped backward before anyone noticed. His hands trembled as he entered the bedroom. He closed the door gently. No anger, no shouting, no confrontation, only silence. After several minutes, he forced himself to smile. He returned downstairs carrying the old photo album. No one suspected what he had heard. Grace happily turned the pages. Olivia complimented old family pictures. Ethan joked about his terrible childhood haircut. William laughed with them. He even told stories. But inside, something had changed forever. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, the house felt heavier than ever. William walked slowly into his study. He unlocked an old oak cabinet. Behind a stack of faded documents sat a small steel lockbox. He opened it carefully. Inside were Helen's wedding ring, several handwritten letters, and a sealed envelope she had asked him never to open unless he truly needed guidance. For years he had honored that promise. For the first time since Helen's funeral, William reached toward the envelope. Then he stopped. He rested his hand on it quietly. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the old maple tree. William looked toward Helen's photograph one more time. "I think," he whispered, "it's finally time."